we're going to talk about our use of LCT, particularly around semantics, and that we've had incredible success. And we want to we're not showing off, but we want to kind of share with you some of our research to practice experiences, and to talk about, the challenges and opportunities, and really to figure out, is this something that is just unique to our context, or is it something that we can all kind of talk about in terms of research to practice, and we can learn from each other. So it's called Tear and Share of LCT Research to Practice. I'm quite interested. I think some of you may have seen this same presentation actually at the conference, but it will be slower this time, and Paul will be hopefully interjecting, and you'll be discussing more. So next slide. So most of the work actually that we're talking about is because of what we've done at Queen Mary University of London, which is where Paul is based and where I used to do my PhD, not actually on semantics, but we did lots of research about semantics at Queen Mary. But I'm now work for the Raspberry Pi Foundation at the Raspberry Pi Computing Education Research Centre. I'm the senior research scientist there, and we're a joint initiative with the University of Cambridge. And I've carried on doing research around LCT and semantics at the foundation. So it kind of spans both organisations now. And the aim for today is to explore with you guys kind of how you explain the theory of LCT beyond your academic work in research to practice. Because I'm interested, how do you do it? This is how we've done it, but how do you do it? And it would be amazing if kind of longer term we could develop some kind of research to practice examples and commentary and guidance for others, and we'd like to kind of start that dialogue by springboarding it with what we did in England in terms of LCT and particularly semantics with respect to computer science. So we're in the field of computer science. So our context is
and also just to say, what we hope to do is apply LCT to this. So this is a knowledge practice of how you do transformational impact from research. And we've based it on other theories that we were on beforehand. But LCT clearly ought to be something you can use to understand this. And so you can see that as the first step of research. And I'd love to have discussion about how you would use LCT to understand this and turn it into a sort of shared understanding of how you do impact from research.
That's a good challenge. So it's what do you do already, and how could we use LCT to illuminate it? So our context is that Carl has been incredibly generous with his time, and he's kind of helped us to apply LCT, particularly semantic profiling, to our computer science context. We've been analysing.
Did you not get the invoices?
Oh no, we haven't. It's quite good that quite a lot of those things go to spam, along with people trying to sell me, or usually visualizers and networking products. So I think you might have been classified as like trying to sell me networking tools. Anyway.
Well, also Queen Mary wouldn't accept an invoice unless they'd issued a contract thing in the first place. So they've probably just gone to the bin if you have sent
them. So yeah, anyway, thanks, Carl, for doing the pre-work. Anyway, we've been analysing our own activities, and we've got like a number of published papers, but mainly we've been doing case studies, and it's been a way to kind of review our own practice. And actually, when I'm talking to practitioners about the opportunity of using LCT, I often say that's a good way to start. And it seems to be, so that they familiarise themselves. And we've actually been using semantic profiling, semantic waves with educators who teach computer science in such a wide range of contexts. When I was kind of creating this presentation, I kind of like, oh, well, we've done it with those teachers, and we've done it with initial teacher trainers. We've done it with resource developers. We've done it with new undergraduate lecturers in computer science. I've done it with the council and professors of heads of computing, who are like the elders of all elders. We've done it with industry professionals. We've just done it with basically anybody who exists in our field. We've had a go at them. But we've also, as well as kind of looking at educators, we've also introduced semantic waves, and Paul can talk more about this, to undergraduate students to support their learning. So we've kind of had, it's been a bit of a scattergun kind of approach. And the other thing that Paul has particularly led on is simplifying things so that they're just a set of simple steps that educators and learners can follow based on kind of semantic profiling.
The other thing about the undergraduate students, that's actually how I started. I was pointed at LCT by Jim Donoghue as a way to help me teach my undergraduates to write. And then all of this that we've done actually about using LCT to understand, practice and teach better is just a spin-off of what I was originally thinking it was useful for, which, so it's actually kind of shifted how we've used it from the original reason I was pointed at it and thought it might be useful.
And that kind of speaks to, we're going to talk about some theories around impact and this idea of knowledge intermediaries. And I think these groups of educators, particularly educators who have influence over others, has been really significant in terms of the breadth of impact we think we've had. Okay, so why computer science and semantic profiling? Well, if you have anything to do with computer science, you'll start to realize we love really dodgy jargon, really complicated words for things. And so it's complex concepts, unfamiliar jargon, and it has been known to be notoriously hard to teach and notoriously hard to learn. And in order to simplify things, and this is pre kind of us even knowing anything about LCT, there's been this use of analogies to support students to learn things. And often we do things in an unplugged way. And Paul's work around in Queen Mary and outreach work has been very much focused on this unplugged approach, where we use everyday context and everyday activities in order to try and explain these very difficult concepts. For example, to explain something that's called a data structure, it's the way that we hold data, and we call it a stack, then we might use a stack of chairs. So that's just one example.
Another example I use a lot is role-playing computation. So we take programs and compile them onto students that are on the stage with roped together, and as you pass a tube around from one person to the next, they execute instructions, and you see visually how the program executes, because the students are role-playing the instructions as they would be executed in a computer, which gives a really deep understanding of what's going on, different to just watching a program run.
And we've written about these unplugged approaches before, and what's been clear is the impact on learning has been very mixed. So although we think that that's a really good way to help people learn these more complex concepts and unfamiliar jargon, that actually sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And there had, again, before we'd kind of learned about LCT, we'd thought that, I don't know if you can see me at this point, you're probably seeing the presentation, but they'd felt like there was a disconnect between the way that we would explain things in an unplugged activity and the actual theory. So we kind of thought there was some kind of schism, some kind of breakage. And we didn't realize that actually semantic profiling would help us to start to explore the way that we weren't making always a link between this kind of contextualized everyday explanation and the theory. And this mixed approach, this mixed findings isn't just for us, it's for within the whole computer science community. So I suppose what I'm saying is there's a reason why semantic profiling came almost to our aid to help us start to illuminate why things might not be working.
And actually, some people were kind of writing off unplugged approaches and just saying they don't work. We've done this little study in a classroom and it was a controlled study, and they didn't learn any better using unplugged than not. And so it's kind of understanding, is that really the case, that it doesn't actually help, or is it just the context that it's being used in, and is there some way, and that's what semantic waves I think gives us, is some way to say, if you do it this way it won't work, if you do it this way then it potentially will work.
Can
And
I
what's
just
interesting
add
to
in
me-
a moment there
Oh,
to say that this is so resonant with so many things that are a very, very long way away from computer studies. So, for example, using the first language of students in teaching a second language, which is outlawed in some dominant approaches, or very badly done in others, or using the funds of knowledge approach, that students bring their everyday experiences and then, it's done in a particularly bad way and then it's written off. And you find this a lot in the sort of approaches that claim to have been influenced by Bernstein. You find that some people there will say, oh, well, do not allow any everyday knowledge in because that will just lead to constructivism. They'll lead to just fiddling about, playing about, and not actually learning any knowledge, rather than saying, maybe it's the way it's being brought in and the way it's being integrated or not. So they throw out the baby with the bathwater just because it's been done badly. And I think that's true of so many approaches in education across so many segments. So I think you're sort of hitting on something that has relevance to just about every segment anybody comes from here.
I agree. And I was a primary school teacher, so I used to teach all subjects. And if I think now, I don't just think about computer science and how I've taught in the past. I also think about how I would have not connected any kind of practical activity, maybe in art or in geography or in science or in maths, where we did something that was some kind of practical everyday example, but then just didn't repack. And it kind of just, now when I reflect, I think it's across so many different contexts in teaching and learning. And it would be really cool to hear about, if the same thing is happening in other places. Right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go for it.
Can I ask a question? What does unplugged mean in this context?
Okay, so you go.
It basically means teaching without computing away from the computer. So the standard way people teach computers, computer science, which seems the obvious way, is you sit people in front of a computer. So if you want to teach programming, you sit them in front of a computer and get them writing programs on the computer and running them. So unplugged. So I teach first year programming. I lecture, and one argument is the lectures are pointless because you should be just getting people actively writing programs. And I teach programming, doing this role playing, acting things out. So recursion, I do a one-man act of The Cat in the Hat Comes Back, which is a children's book that actually embodies the idea of recursion in it. We do role playing. I do magic tricks that are about computation. The way magic works is actually all computation, and computer science is about computation, so you can understand a lot of the concepts like that. So earlier in the week I gave a talk to teachers about how much you can teach just using simple puzzles. There's all sorts of areas of computer science that you can cover, from algorithms, data representation, just by giving pupils puzzles to do. Of course, if you just give them a puzzle to do, all they'll do is a puzzle and think they learned about puzzles. And so that's where this comes in. You're not really teaching the topic necessarily. If you're just doing these unplugged activities, you could be just showing them a magic trick or getting them to do a puzzle. And it's how do you turn that into active learning where they're really learning the topic? But it's using games, puzzles, magic, mysteries, role play, storytelling, any kind of thing. In this country, it's kind of Blue Peter technology is the sort of way I'd explain it. And it's sort of inspired. So Tim Bell in New Zealand actually is the original person who came up with the term unplugged, but though people have been using variations of it for a long, long time. And ultimately it's the sort of a physical version of using metaphors to teach concepts. But in this country, if you know about Blue Peter, my version of it, it's using Blue Peter technology to teach ICT. instead of computer technology to teach it. Does that help?
Is that
That absolutely helps. Thank you. Before that, it was a
brilliant?
fashion term.
That's really cool. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to talk about some theories and language related to research to practice. And that kind of helps us, that's helped Paul and I to kind of think about where it is that it's worked. So why is it that semantics, and particularly semantic profiling, seems to have become so popular, or appears to be popular within England, to teach computer science? And this is just trying to help us reveal that. So there's something called the knowledge appropriation model, which it's Tobias Ley who has introduced this, and he actually used this model in order to talk about house building and how people in the house building industry in Germany, they take practical guidance and it actually goes from guidance into like all of the different building groups are using it. And it's this idea that you introduce some kind of new theory or guidance, and to begin with, you have to create awareness, which is in the middle, and then you scaffold people to start to use the guidance, and then you start to fade away the support, so they're going through this scaffolding experience, and then the actual new practice, it matures as they start to share it between themselves, they co-create, formalize, and then suddenly they're just using it. It's kind of standardized and your job is done. So if we pop into our heads that first little bit of kind of language that might be useful as we're thinking about why is it that our research practice activities have landed so well. And the kinds of things that we've done is we've tended to share about LCT in normal research conferences, but also seminars, in which case we're just kind of sharing what we already have. We've also developed and run lots of professional development. So we've been running these courses with all these different kinds of people. And we've had as well pedagogy summaries, we've written magazine articles, book chapters. So we've kind of moved into this kind of phase of synthesis where we're kind of guiding as to how this could be used. But then what's been interesting is to see different groups within the community just use it in their teaching and in their resource development. So we've kind of seen it move into the maturation kind of phase, through people just taking it. So it's kind of research in action.
Oh, one thing about that, just say about the request help part about that. So the context here is they just changed the curriculum about 10 years ago from ICT to computer science, and suddenly within a year or so, teachers with no experience even of ICT, maybe their PE teachers, just the ones given the job of teaching ICT, are having to teach computer science and programming and things they have no knowledge about. So there was like this gigantic cry for help, essentially, that people desperately needed help in how to teach. And so that's partly where we started doing this, just giving pedagogy courses and introducing ways that, to teach unplugged and simple ways to teach the topic to try and help the teachers get up to speed. So I think one of the special contexts is that there was this desperate need for help that a lot of people, not just us, were then trying to step in to the breach and give that help. So there was sort of this desire for help in the first place.
And another way that people seem to talk about this, how you manage processes across boundaries, so how you take knowledge and you transfer, translate and transform it. And again, kind of using Carlisle's kind of theories, these research conferences and seminars, they were just transfer, we're just throwing it over the top, we're not really doing much translation. But all of those professional development courses, the pedagogy summaries and so on, we're starting to translate it, but then the transformation is not happening from us really, apart from when we are adapting our own practice. But actually in terms of research to practice, it's when teachers are actually doing it themselves. So this transfer, translation and transformation. Now, Laura Mayer has worked with Paul on various initiatives, and she's written about impact. And so we've kind of looked as well at her research and her kind of theories. And she talks about impact types in terms of whether they're instrumental, conceptual, capacity building, and so on. And I've got those kind of written down, and it's in terms of what that meant for us. So instrumental is when you're changing the plans, decisions, behaviors, practices, actions, and policies. And we definitely had an impact in terms of the practices and policies, of which we'll explain more in more detail as we go through. And in terms of conceptual, we believe that we've had an impact in terms of changing people's knowledge because of the professional development and the various resources we've built. And in terms of capacity building, we've really worked hard in our professional development for those who are participating to do it in practice, so that then they can apply it in their own context. And we're part of a group called Computing at Schools, CAS, and one of the big things that CAS talk about is if you're doing professional development, people have to be able to take something away with them and apply it in their classroom. And that's kind of a bit of a mantra that we have within our kind of field of helping teachers, is that if we're going to do something with them, it's got to be practical.
And practical, they could take it away immediately and use it, not just that if they put a lot of work in, they can use it. It's give a talk, always give them something that they can use immediately in the classroom tomorrow.
And I think semantic sorry, carry on.
I have nothing more to say.
I was just going to say, and I think semantic profiling, but it just resonated every time I've taught. I think I must have taught it to maybe 1,000 educators now, which is crazy. But every time I do it, they kind of go, "Oh, this makes sense." Yeah. And they start to, do the waves with their hands and go, "Oh, all I do is down escalator." So it kind of resonates. And Laura talks about these different impact mechanisms, and we happen to already have lots of relationships within the community. So before LCT came into our lives, we already were part of the CAS community. We were part of BCS. Paul's on all sorts of different boards, and so am I. So we've kind of got these connections in. We definitely, we to a degree we're interdisciplinary, maybe, but I think mostly it is around computer science and education. But we've got these strong links with these key knowledge intermediaries. And I'm interested to know whether these knowledge intermediaries are easy for others to get, to get at in the same way as it was for us. And then Laura also talks about
interdisciplinary. It is. We're taking sociology into computer science, so that part of it is part of the impact that we're doing. That's interdisciplinary.
That's very true. And then in terms of the causes of impact, because we Laura talks about those, about the level of importance, and so the way the problem is framed. And as Paul said before, we had a problem space that needed a solution. And so we filled that gap kind of thing. And in terms of research management, that's this idea that there's an integration between disciplines, teams, and how you plan your research studies and how that then might have a research to impact strand. And I think that we kind of do that automatically because we're kind of very much situated with the practitioners. Inputs is just about previous work, and also kind of capacity and turnover and things like that. And we've been really lucky, I suppose, that we already are established within the field, so we're kind of trusted. And also we've had some funding from the Mayor of London, from the Institute of Coding, that's all been able to help us with that. And then the output is the same idea, that it seems to be useful to teachers. And we've been able to use the dissemination as these knowledge intermediaries. And I think it's really important, this context that, as Paul was saying, we had this context of a need, and also our connections to various Department for Education contracts and initiatives that we were able to kind of piggyback on. Has anyone got any questions on that one? Because I think Laura's work is really interesting in terms of research to practice.
Also, partly I've been working with Laura for a long time, so to some extent I'd got this model in my head of this was what I was thinking I was sort of trying to do. And certainly the knowledge intermediaries, I'd got that in my head that that's the way you get big impact. You don't do it yourself. You find the right other people to work with who will then take it after you've stopped and moved on to something else.
So the last thing is just Kane's kind of view of how research knowledge becomes pedagogical content knowledge. And what's really interesting for me is I've got on the left-hand side, we've got this knowledge generated by research being propositional, theoretical, and so on. But what we kind of already do is we start to move it. And I think that's what LCT is wonderful about. It kind of moves it into this procedural and practical knowledge already. And rather than it being, although there is some amazing generalized and abstract kind of theories that underpin it, it kind of is already transitioning as, because it is a way to analyze learning experiences or sociological experiences. It's already transitioning into the PCK field for teachers to be able to use. And although we have narrowly used it in terms of our own learning experiences, as we then do it in the professional development context, we get teachers to use it for their purposes. So we actually keep it quite narrow, but we keep it so it is practical and it's fit for their purpose. So I think that's kind of interesting for me, is that it isn't this kind of ivory tower type of research theory. It's one that is very practical. And again, I don't know if other people have really, see that in LCT. Yeah. So now we're going to do things that will bring that. So that was all the stuff that was at the top of the wave, really. Now we're kind of going down the bottom of the wave. So we're going to talk about some of the actual things that we did. So we started off seems like a very, very long time ago, where I analysed a learning activity that was the most popular primary way. So in primary schools, K-5 schools, it was a way to teach about algorithms. And this was introduced in our schools, that anyone who's from the age of 5 years and onwards has to know what an algorithm is. And you can imagine that non-primary teachers at this point in time, they were kind of started to have nervous breakdowns. This is around 2012. And so as part of a different project that I was working on, the Barefoot Project, had this unplugged way of explaining what an algorithm was, and it was very, very popular, but we didn't know why it was popular. It seemed to be working, and so we waved it. So I've not got an actual picture of the wave, but with Carl, we analysed it and we could see that it was a wave. But that was just a normal presentation that I did at a conference, and it was kind of like one of these underpinning things, but we weren't at that point kind of doing teacher professional development, but that was just kind of, in terms of knowledge appropriation, it was kind of just this making people aware, but at conferences. We also ran a dozen professional development courses, where these courses were about networks, geographical information systems, 3D animations, games design, industry programming, art and design, all sorts of different courses. But in every single course, we included semantic waves and semantic profiling. So we just embedded it. We're teaching about these other technical subjects, but then we included semantics and semantic profiling as a pedagogical a way for people to analyze their pedagogy. And every time we introduced it, people loved it. And it was very practical because it was within the particular context that we were teaching. So if I think about the art and design course that we ran, I had very technical people talking about the kind of different programming aspects of art and design. And then I would talk about the the use of semantic profiling. So we just kind of embedded it. It just became something that was just our way of kind of delivering about our subject, but across all different contexts. And this was within all these courses, we talked about all of these different pedagogical models, and there was semantic waves. It was just always there in amongst it. And we actually, with a set of industry professionals, we asked them which they thought of all the different pedagogical approaches that we'd introduce them to, which one they thought would be most useful for their students. And semantic waves won. I know. So, woohoo. And then we went back to a small subset of the people who'd been on the course, I think 5 of them, 6 months later, and we said, which one of all these different pedagogical approaches that we introduced to you, which one did you use? And semantic waves won. And interestingly, actually, number 2 is context-specific examples, which I would argue is just the same, it's a similar kind of idea as semantic waves. So the top 2 were related to this idea of, here's a complicated theory, let's do something practical, and then make sure that you link it back. So I think that's, for me, that was really interesting. I didn't expect it. I really did not expect it at the time, but that's
and something also interesting about that, I think, is PRIM is a fairly recent thing that's basically taken the world by storm as a sort of outline way of, this is the good way to teach programming. But it's quite, in some sense, it's technical, a bit convoluted. So in the long term, I would expect PRIM to be the way forward in terms of a very specific thing about how you teach programming, and to some extent that is what's happening. But it's interesting here that just working with people who are perhaps novices, it's obviously too complicated to just take on. It isn't a thing you can just go away and use immediately, and that's one of the things that I think semantic waves is. So semantic waves is very general, perhaps, whereas PRIM is very specific. It's multiple steps. It's this is a whole package of how you teach programming, and how you shouldn't teach it. And I think you can understand PRIM through semantic waves as well as to why it works well. But the fact that that comes down the list and hardly anybody at all has actually used it is partly sad, but it's saying something about the way they're easier to pick up.
Jane, have you written this up anywhere? This stuff about it being picked up and used?
It's so annoying. It keeps getting rejected. So it doesn't fit with, because it's industry professionals, not in schools and not undergraduates. When I sent it up to our CS Ed groups, they just rejected it and said it doesn't belong to us. So I've got it sitting over there. It's sitting there. I'm going to try and put it into an IEEE conference.
Do these people know what the word education means?
Anyway, that's how it was. But it's there, ready to go again. Okay. After we've done the autonomy paper. And this is kind of how it looked in practice, because we ran these pre-COVID, post-COVID, and during COVID, and then after. During COVID, then after. And when we were doing them online, what we would do is kind of give, because it was over 6 sessions, 6 1-hour sessions, and each session we would introduce another group of pedagogical approaches, and we would do it with these little dots. The people would kind of log on and they would move the little dots around to say whether they understood something or they didn't understand something. And at the beginning of a session, we would say, right, do you know about Bloom's taxonomy? No. Do you know about Solo? No. Do you know about semantic waves? No. Do you know about the whatever? So you can kind of see that people were saying red means I don't know what you're talking about, Jane. Amber is, well, I've got a clue, and green is I'm good to go. And we would do this at the beginning of a session, and then we would do it at the end. And I don't think I should have put one in, but always at the end, semantic waves will be green.
It's 2 slides away.
Is it 2 slides away?
Keep going.
Okay. There it goes. So you would kind of see like this kind of change from reds to greens. The reason why continuum scaffolding was red on that one was because I didn't get round to it. But what we would do actually in the sessions was, it was all very practical, and they would go into groups and they would actually profile an activity that they did. So they weren't profiling our activities. I would put them into little groups. They would decompose, they would break into parts and act something that they already taught, and then they would actually have a go at waving it. And then we would talk about how they could improve the wave, and we would put in little extra sticky notes. So they would use these online sticky notes in order to draw their profile, so that then at the end they knew how to go and do that for themselves. And I worked really hard to put people into groups where they would understand each other's context. So if I was dealing with, say, a group of teachers, I would put the primary teachers together and secondary teachers together. Or if I was with industry professionals, I put people from the same department or the same function together, so that then they've got a common context that they are talking about in their professional development. Right. We also, I forgot we even did this. In the teaching of programming, we have labs where literally, how many people are in a lab, Paul?
Well, 500 altogether in 2 labs of 250 across 3 floors and 4 or 5 rooms.
So you know, like, one lecturer can't run a lab by themselves. So we have an army of other students who are, some of them might be postdocs, some might be PhD students, but often they are just older students on the same course, and they're called demonstrators.
Mostly on my module, it's 2nd and 3rd years teaching the 1st years.
And there's literally an army of them, and they kind of come into the labs and they support the other students. And I used to do the training for them, and I introduced them to semantic profiling and semantic waves, just to help them to try and think about, am I explaining this at a theory level, at a practical level? And if I've done some practical work with them, then I need to help them to see how that links back up. And again, they loved it. And then we've also used semantic waves at the foundation in order to analyze feedback from multiple choice questions. So we've kind of used it in lots of different ways. And I presented this online to an organization called the CSTA, which is a Computer Science Teachers Association in the States. It's absolutely massive. It's like this huge conferences that they have, and I think there were like 100 people in this session that I did online. And so it's, I suppose what I'm trying to say is the breadth of instances where we shared this theory with all sorts of different practitioners who are in our field. Paul has spent loads of time as well producing some really lovely resources that are on the website. So that's on the it's the Teaching and Computing website, and also CS for Fun website. So there are web pages that are written for our practitioners, if you see what I mean. They're for our context, and teachers can go and have a look at those. But the best
I should apologize. That's wrong. It should be harder to understand, easier to understand.
There you go.
But that's before I knew the proper way to do things.
Cool. But the best bit is that now we don't even have to do that, because other people in the community are writing their own blogs and resources, and they're running their own professional development. So this is a lovely William Lau, who is not on our he's not on our payroll. He's just a wonderful computer science teacher who just loved this, and so he's gone off now, and he's selling it to other people as well. So he's got his own blogs and he's done his own professional development on it. This quick read, we have these two-page summaries of different pedagogical approaches, which have been adopted by a large-scale initiative to support teachers who are trying to deliver this subject. So it's government funded. And Paul, did you write this? I can't even remember.
I didn't write it. Somebody from NCCE wrote it, but Carl and myself both helped and commented, and it's based on stuff that I'd originally written. I think they just took that and adapted it. Oh, and it's interesting to some extent how this came about. I think is an interesting part of the story in terms of how you have big impact. So partly the reason for this is it's the National Centre for Computing Education, and I was part of, well, I'm on the advisory board, the academic advisory board of it, that meets a few times a year, 3 or 4 times a year. And at the start of that, they asked each of the members of the advisory board, there's only 5 of us, they asked each of us to, at one of the meetings, to give a talk about something we thought would be useful. And I gave my talk about semantic waves. And so this, to some extent, happened after that. So that's us talking to the people in the National Centre for Computing Education who actually have the power to make things happen, and they essentially then adopted it and said, okay, this should be one of the pedagogical principles we both teach and use ourselves in the resources we develop. So it came about because of, to some extent, who I am, and the fact that I got that position because of my positions in CAS, and I've been on the Royal Society committee that had advised the government that they ought to create something like the NCCE. So the backstory of how we got to this point goes back a long way in terms of my connections and the things I'd been doing long before any of this happened, and long before I even knew anything about LCT. But it was then right place, right time. And also Jane at this point had moved to Raspberry Pi, and so was presumably also helping behind the scenes, sort of to encourage this sort of thing to happen.
So at the foundation, for the resources they were developing for the NCCE, so basically the Raspberry Pi Foundation were part of the group who were developing all the resources for schools, and we had a set of pedagogy principles. Guess what? Semantic Waves made sure that was on it. So it was a kind of this almost 2-pronged approach. So we were kind of really just attacking people from all angles. They couldn't avoid it, really. We also wrote magazines. This is a magazine article I wrote about semantic waves, which came from that original research paper. And this is the magazine that the Raspberry Pi Foundation create. We're in the Big Book of Computing, which again, that's from the Raspberry Pi Foundation, where we've got our pedagogy principles, which includes about semantic waves. Sue Sentence is, I work for her at the Raspberry Pi Foundation and within the research centre. She's got this book, Computer Science Education, and there's did you write that chapter, Paul, on semantics?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then there's Sushi Grover. She's got a book that is teacher facing. We've got a chapter in there, and also we've got like a research handbook, and it's in there. So we've kind of, it's attacking people from all different parts. So like from research, resource development, initial teacher training, and actually teacher professional development. This is the 10, well, is it 10 or 12? I can't remember. The 12 pedagogy principles at the Raspberry Pi Foundation. And this is the idea that it's government funded resource and it's part of standards. And there is the unplug, unpack, repack. So semantic waves is kind of hidden, where it's part of that particular principle. And we as well have managed to get on Ofsted. So Ofsted is they're the people who go into schools to ensure quality of teaching and learning, and within their review of pedagogy for teaching computing, semantics is in there as well. So it's become this recommended pedagogy. And if you go onto school websites now, this was just an entirely random search. I went for semantics. I looked for semantic waves, and just this one particular primary school has got semantic waves in there. And that's because they are using the NCC resources. The NCC resources talk about semantics because it's on the 12 pedagogy principles, because Paul was there, I was there, and it all just happened at the right time.
And also Ofsted were doing this review on the back of it, and they were talking to NCCE and CAS, and so because NCCE and CAS had taken it up, the people at Ofsted then therefore knew about it, so it was basically in their face of something to think about. And also it's in a school's interest to put things like this on their website, because that then, as long as they then follow it up and Ofsted inspections, they see it happen, then it kind of shows at the outset that they're doing the stuff that Ofsted have said they ought to be doing.
In more recent work, I'm still at the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and we are developing resources for AI. So that's teaching of AI in classrooms. And one of the things that I've been championing again is semantic waves. And what we've been doing there is, when we are developing explanations for these new words that are just so hard to understand, rather than having just one-line definitions, we've constructed so I need to say to Steve Kirk and Anna Vera, we did this before we'd read your research about using the different colours, but we just automatically have started to colour code top of the wave, middle of the wave, bottom of the wave, and then repacking. And it's been so helpful for me to support the resource developers. So these are people in the business at the Raspberry Pi Foundation who are creating these resources, to think deeply about how we explain these very new concepts and about the context that we do. So it's been really helpful for them. So in summary, we've kind of done the academic studies. And those academic studies, we've obviously done the work. I've seen now people talking about using semantic profiling in the States, in Finland, Germany. Now we've got Frau Rika, I think her name is, with Bernard Standel. They've started to use semantics as well. So we're starting to have like an effect at the academic side. We've got loads of professional development, but that's predominantly been in the UK and the US that we've done it. We've got all these resources, just so many resources, but that's again been predominantly UK, but we are now starting to have an international range. And then we've also been able to influence standards and principles through government advice, educational resource design principles, and school pedagogy principles. So the theory that's resonated, I suppose, for me, is, if we go back to Lay, is that we've moved beyond just creating awareness. We've kind of matured things through our own work, but we've been able to let go, because others are now kind of moving things around the maturation cycle. And again, it's others have kind of moved. We've kind of started the transfer, we started the translation, but the transformation, because we've been able to influence the resources that are being delivered in class, that's having the transformational kind of side of things. And in terms of Laura's work, for dissemination, the professional development, and then all these resources, I think that's really helped with dissemination. The outputs, they are absolutely situated within the context of the community that we're trying to influence. It's using their language and their particular context. We've really worked hard in terms of relationship building, but we already had that. But we have kind of used these knowledge intermediaries, and they've taken it forward. And we had a context where the government were already sponsoring change. So we were kind of lucky. We were really lucky in that we were able to use that. We were able to ride the wave as well. So questions. how do you already take your research to practice? How do you use dissemination, outputs, relationships, intermediaries, and context? What are the barriers? And how can we help each other with research to practice? And that's the bonus question is.
And that's my bonus question. How do we do it with LCT, which is I'm really interested in, because we've used all these other theories that were the things we knew before we came to LCT, but LCT seems like it's obvious they ought to be able to help understand this. And it feels to me, I mean, we talked a little with Carl about this, but you know, there's semantics going on in the way we've sort of manipulated the theory and how we present it, that there's sort of, maybe it's specialization, but certainly who people are has made a difference. And the knowledge intermediaries seems to be somehow talking to that in some way. And autonomy is probably coming in there as well. And that's a sort of start of what I would like to do, some proper research looking at how LCT helps you understand this. But right now I don't understand LCT, all of it, well enough to really know how and where, and I'd just be interested in people's thoughts on which bits of LCT actually explain those theories, and does it do it better?
And one of the things that comes to my mind is, you know, like obviously you've done work that has been problem driven. So, you know, you've oriented towards people's problems, which is a sort of a kind of autonomy sort of issue. It's like, what is their particular way of talking about things, their sort of their target content, as it were, and what are their target purposes. So much educational research that I have seen in conferences that have often been sort of described as being practical or involving practitioners, or at least I've met teachers. There's been so much research that just doesn't seem to, you know, understand what a teacher even does, or the problems that they have and they face in classrooms. I think sort of aligning with the interests and the purposes of what he's talking to those purposes, you know, and understanding those purposes is really, really important. Because, you know, I mean, it's not always possible, but at least you can say, I mean, when I've done talks to things like EAP people or other types of people like the academic development, I have to say very quickly that, you know, I don't do what you do, and this will require some understanding of what you need to sort of recontextualize this to your own things that you face. But at least understanding that these are tools to empower people so they can they can interject them into their practice. They can turn them to their purposes, you know. So I've used them for this person's used them for that, these people have used them for that, and you could turn them to your purposes as well. So there's certainly an autonomy aspect to the way in which you can present it to people. And of course, there's the semantic aspect, because you're not just flatlining, you know, like flatlining low or flatlining high, but trying to show that, you know, you can take this away. And as you said, you know, you want people to be able to take it away. I like to describe LCT as being like, you know, for me, it should be for practitioners like educators, it should feel a bit like unwrapping your phone, turning it on and using it. And there's an enormous amount of technology inside that. The software, the hardware is extraordinarily complex, but you don't need to know any of it to be able to use it, to make it work. You don't need to know that we can analyze semantic density and semantic gravity down to the word and to the clausing and sequencing levels. You don't need to know that. You don't need to know the fine mesh detail of all these things to be able to get there and use it. And so, you know, the experience of that kind of the person at the chalk face, as it were, doesn't have to be the same as the researcher, you know. So again, another aspect, I suppose, would be those different fields: research fields, curriculum fields, pedagogic fields, and understanding the logics of those things. Our logics in research fields are not the logics in pedagogic fields. That includes their problems and their things, you know, that they're interested in. So yeah, when you're doing it and you're showing them and you're saying, look, you know, and you can take this home, plug it in, as it were, and use it immediately. That's the sort of thing that you want, you know. You don't want necessarily to get something and then they say, you know, and it's yours in only 17 monthly installments and self-assembly if you take this other course and understand it. They're not going to, practitioners are not going to, they're already maxed out. They've already got too much to do. They've already got so many people telling them how to do their job,
And I think one of the things that struck me that I only thought about when I started thinking it in LCT terms is there are, for example, lots of different purposes going on by the different people we've interacted with. That some of them are sort of overlapping, but what Ofsted is after is different to what the teachers themselves are after, and the head teachers who decided to put stuff on the websites, it's different, and the NCCE itself has two different, well, possibly even three different purposes. One is to actually teach teachers and do continual professional development, but they're also creating resources that go directly to the students, and so it's embedded into that in two different ways for two completely different purposes at one level, and again with the different logics. It's sort of they're teaching people how to curriculum plan, and they're also kind of writing direct resources that children will use off of their website without the teachers necessarily intervening. And in industry, again, people have got slightly different purposes of what they're doing and why they're even going into schools in the first place. So there's all sorts of different things going on as you move from one context to another with this. But that thing about it being simple, I think, is one of the wonderful things that Semantic Waves in particular just work. We didn't have to do an awful lot, because even though it's very abstract and technical in the theory behind it, all you have to do is sort of the wave, and you've immediately got people behind you and they understand and they can take away and use it.
And we've got a bunch of people here who've done this, like Lee, enormously impactful in teacher education in South Africa and elsewhere, and people who work with other people like Marnell. I'm just looking at people on the screen here. Marnell's worked with science educators and so on. Like there's loads of people here. How have you, jump in and tell us how you've managed to sell this stuff or engage with people's problems or whatever. I mean, it's not selling it. This is not a pyramid scheme. And I get absolutely zero to, I was talking to somebody recently in a non-academic context, in a personal social context, in which they kept asking me about what I was doing. And they kept saying, "Oh, do you get paid for that?" They did not understand. No. And I was like, "Oh, big impact here. Do you get paid for that?" And nope, it's all free. So it's not trying to sell anything, but I just mean, how did you guys go about engaging with different audiences and in connecting to their needs and issues and wants? Anybody?
I took a real problem, and I didn't. Yeah, I used the semantics to show how we were dealing with this and so on, and people just then saw the power of the idea. I found that when I started in the early days with first I'm going to tell you about semantics, then we're going to see how it works, that kind of just put people off because they just got choked by the terminology. So it was almost like showing them the magic of the problem and how it could help us think about things in different ways and reveal things, like what you are doing and what you could be doing, for example. And then that was kind of like, okay, people wanted more. Now then they wanted the kind of the technical detail. So I think that was like a very much more successful approach in my context.
I think we very quickly moved from the technical vocabulary. So we kind of did wave it. We went, there are all these technical words, but don't worry about that. And then we kind of very quickly unpacked that to being the words that teachers found easy to do. And then they just did it in practice themselves. And to be honest, when we were repacking it for them, we often still left it at abstract concepts or abstract contexts and more technical vocabulary. So, I think we kind of did have a simplified version for teachers, which I'm comfortable with.
One of the things when I've been doing CPD with teachers as well that I think helps is what I'm aiming to do. Generally, I'm doing what Jane was saying, adding this on to a talk about something else. So most of what I do is go out and sort of show people, look, you can use Unplugged to teach this and that. You know, these are ways you might not have thought about. And Unplugged itself is really good as a takeaway. You know, you don't need an awful lot, and you can just go and do it. You know, get some rope and you can wire some students together and make a neural network or whatever. So it's very easy to take away once you've seen it happen. And so I'm actually doing these talks where I'm actually doing the Unplug work, and I've been doing that for years. And then now I've started then adding on a few slides about semantic waves that's just saying, and this is what you ought to be thinking about while you're doing it. And so I'm giving them something really practical to do. And then I'm also giving them something really practical to tag onto it, but it's embedded in, this is the thing that I'm doing already, and I'm just showing you. And you know, semantics waves is just telling you why it works and how to make it work. So it's sort of almost a doubly practical thing, again focusing on their problem, because I'm the Unplugged is the thing that's really solving their initial problem. How on earth do I teach this thing that I don't understand myself? And then giving some theory behind it also gives confidence, I think, that, okay, I can understand why this ought to work, and as well as how to do it well.
I think the strength of the semantic wave is its dynamic nature. If you look at something like Bloom's taxonomy, there was an assumption that you start at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, and by the time you're a well-educated person, you'll be at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, and that's where you stay. And smart people are up here and dumb people are down here, and that's the end of it. But this ability to wave in and out and to use it as the basis of explanation and teaching is a radical thought, that you can just wind it down. And if it doesn't work, then keep winding down until you get to the point where it does work. And then you can repack and wind up to your more complex concept is really important.
And actually, an interesting thing about Bloom's taxonomy, I've always felt, is programming is naturally at the top of the wave. At the top of Bloom's taxonomy. It's one of the top level things. It ain't down at the bottom at all. And you can't teach programming by starting at the bottom. You teach programming somehow by starting at the top. And I never quite understood that, but now I think it's because you wave within Bloom's taxonomy itself. And you know, what we're doing in England is we're teaching programming to primary school kids from age 5 now. So we're absolutely not treating it as that's the expert thing that eventually you'll get to as you become educationally more developed. You're writing programs somehow or other, you know, straight away. And
I think that point about the dynamic nature is extremely important. I mean, so many of these models, particularly about types of knowledge, are static, and teaching is something that unfolds temporally. It's a practice, it's a process, and so often I don't understand why people write about these static types of knowledge as if you just kind of bring it in as a block at some point, and then you bring in another block and so on. Because, you know, like pedagogy, I mean, I have to say, by the way, that a number of people who theorize may not have spent any time in, near, or looking at a classroom for a very long time indeed. Because what happens as you go through the academic hierarchy in an educational institution, for example, would be that as a professor, you become more and more focused on running the institution, perhaps, for example, or just PhD students, and not actually engaging in raw data all the time. I think data keeps you honest. And one of the things of, you know, studying so many classrooms is that you just get used to seeing it as a constant negotiating dynamic process all the time, for which you need a model that is constant and dynamic. And the idea of waves is that they are constantly moving, you know, because time keeps moving. I mean, you might flatline, but even there, you're kind of like bumbling along a little bit, and something's happening usually. It is, and the fact that it doesn't. One thing I like is that it doesn't valorize any one type over another type. So one of the things I kind of need to make sure, as I'm writing this chapter on semantics for the book, one of the things I'm going to make sure is that people realize that the semantic wave doesn't start and end at the top. It just so happened that when I was doing one picture in one early paper, that was one that was there. But you can have, you know, ones that go up and then go down. one's the start and the middle, and all sorts of things. There's no right beginning and right end. It very much depends upon what you're doing.
Mm.
And
I think
you have waves following waves. It's not just a single thing. And I think that's an important thing that helps with this as well, that you can think about it as, okay, this one little segment of an activity or a whole activity or a whole lesson, or how one lesson leads into the next lesson, so that it's temporal, but it works over different levels of granularity.
And what I like about this is just like a kind of a fangirling the whole theory, but anyway, what I like about it kind of empowers educators. It gives them a language, and because it is temporal and because it's nuanced and it's relative, then it's almost like it liberates them to be able to try things that are a bit, I'm going to go a bit stronger or a bit weaker, or I'm going to kind of make this kind of take a bit more time, and who is it that's doing the unpacking and repacking. And whereas I think something like Bloom's taxonomy or Solow taxonomy, it's either it is this or it isn't this, whereas this is kind of, it's nice and messy, or it can be messy, and that's what teaching's like. And it's messy over time, and it's messy over complexity, and it's messy for different children. Always one of the questions is, which that they're whoever you're presenting to, whether they're really listening or not, they go, but surely the profile's going to be different for different kids. And you go, yes, because they're thinking straight away that the experience, the intended versus enacted, is going to be different. And I think for me, it's just it seems to resonate, and when something resonates, then it's going to stick. So that was a little.
There is if it grows bigger and bigger, there will be, of course, the next stage of which is to the potential for it to harden into some sort of fetishized, universal, singular, imposed solution. That so often happens with these things. Now we must use this. And so that people have to start showing that they're doing it when they're not actually. I mean, semantic waves and semantic profiling and all this stuff is supposed to be tools to empower practitioners to do what they want to do, and not some way of measuring people against a standard by which they are then judged. And if that begins to start happening, we have to sort of wave our hands and say that is not LCT. It's nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's supposed to be tools for practitioners to be able to go, I want to achieve this. So if you want a flat line, good for you. Do it mindfully and masterfully and know what you're doing, which, I've seen world famous scholars flatline like mad. So, but they're doing it to a very specific audience.
And that's also the potential danger of Ofsted having taken this up, because Ofsted are basically the organization that tell teachers this is what you should do, or at least tell them you are actually not doing it well enough. But within Ofsted, there is this sort of, what they're supposed to be doing is not telling teachers how to do it. They're supposed to be finding out whether teachers are doing what they say they're doing, is more the ethos behind it. But you get the impression that it doesn't necessarily always turn out that way, that it could be it's embedded, you must have semantic waves, and if the people doing the inspections sort of think semantic waves are a very singular, specific way of doing it, that they could ossify it and say somebody isn't doing it well enough or whatever. So there are dangers in what we've done, that we're possibly moving in that direction.
Possibly, but I think one thing we have to keep doing is to keep reminding there's no, LCT does not model anything.
Yeah.
So there is no model. So some people will pick up on semantic waves and they'll go, oh, that's why. I tell you what, it is such a deep-seated way of thinking in academia that I struggle to explain LCT to people. That when they say, oh, what's LCT? And I kind of go, it's a set of tools for people to use to understand and change their practice. And they're going to go, well, that's vague nonsense. Well, they don't say this, but I can see in their face that they understand that to be vague nonsense, which is true, because it is vague nonsense. That's like MIST trying to understand that. It's like, oh, what does that mean? What they want is a hard, like, I tell people to do this, this is how things should be done. And I understand why people want that. But fundamentally, as LCT people, we should know that LCT doesn't tell you what to do. It says, what do you want to achieve? Okay, here are the tools for you to be able to figure out how to do that. Or what do you want to achieve? I've analyzed it and you're achieving something else. Is that what you wanted to achieve? You know, because that's what you are achieving. So you say you want to do this. There's the rhetoric. Here's the reality. Do you want to change the rhetoric to match the reality, or actually change the reality to match the rhetoric? Which way around do you want to do? Here's the tools to be able to do that. And just, you know, it doesn't say you must do it this way or this way or this way, which always becomes a universal panacea, which is then imposed upon everything. And as we know, the variables here are, you know, like so many. Every single kid in the school, in the classroom, every teacher, every context, every kind of knowledge, and then entire discipline. You know, people talk about disciplines or subjects as if they're uniform. No, they're not. There's so many different kinds of knowledge in every kind of subject area, you know, as well as what time of night, you know, what time of day it is. Like, you know, like kids act in different ways and get different things, and different activities work at different times of the week and different before or after lunch or whatever. I mean, like, if you start imposing this thing on people rather than saying there's a way of being able to understand what you do and to do what you want to do better. Now, there is the danger there that they could go all off and, you know, do a pile of shit. But, you know, I am a natural optimist with faith in humanity.
One of the things that
Sorry.
I'm doing at the moment is so this is sort of internally, because I'm kind of been doing a bunch of talks internally to academics in Queen Mary at different levels, but I'm sort of pushing it as it's a tool for reflection. You know, what this is brilliant at is just simplifying things in a way that it allows you to reflect on your practice. You know, it's not telling you what the right thing to do is, but it is giving you a nice picture of what you are doing and is that what you intended to do, and it kind of gives you some pointers as to things you could nudge to do it better. So I just did an teaching observation of somebody, and with that it was kind of, you know, here are some things that you could think about that semantics will give you a bit of a handle on how you might improve them, and it doesn't say exactly the way you should do it, and some of it, but it tells you some of the things you are doing that probably what tells you why they're working, and but also other things why they're not working. And I think
I quickly should just add a PS into what I said, which is when you're working with like people who just come off the street straight into university and want to learn how to be a teacher, you know, you're not going to be able to say to them, what is it you want to do? Here's the tools to, you need to be able to say, like, this is bad teaching, this is good teaching, this has waves, this doesn't, you know. That's fair enough, because it's not just a case of like free to be you and me sort of thing, because otherwise you'll just end up with shit everywhere. So I'm not saying relativism, I'm just saying we don't have a universal solution, that's all.
So at the very moment, my group of 600 first years are doing an assignment where I've given them a lesson on fire safety. And by all accounts, this is a lovely, lovely lesson. The teacher is delightful. She interacts with the kids. She asks them questions. They respond. But if you actually have a look at it through a semantic wave, it's just one tip after another. You know, make sure that there's a bucket of sand, but she never gets to the principle that the bucket of sand is important because it provides a barrier between the oxygen and the fuel. She never gets to that level of principle. So I'm hoping that my first year students straight out of school will now be able to see how actually segmented and how flatline-ish this particular lesson is. So they're submitting next week. So but this is the whole thing, to get them to identify, observe, analyze, see what's happening, see what's not happening, see what could be happening before we put them into the classroom themselves.
I just want to add, by the way, to people's, sorry, Paul, I just want to add to people, like, don't look at, say, Lee's massive impact, like, so 50 odd thousand students now in South Africa have learned LCT, student teachers, or Paul and Jane's amazing impact in computing studies, where semantic wave seems to have just taken over computer studies education in a matter of like a few years. It's just gone viral, funny enough. And think, oh, that's like something that's unprecedented or cannot be reached. I mean, all of these things that we do started from something really simple. Like, LCT didn't begin, I didn't create a theory with an intention to create a theory. It began from trying to solve a problem that came out of a contradiction. And I tried to use some concepts from Bernstein, the contradiction that didn't make any sense until I realized how to solve the contradiction. And then eventually other things happened, and this kept happening over again. And then suddenly it was a theory of its own. And it's the same thing, like a group, you end up with two people chatting to each other on a regular basis, or maybe three. And then before you know it, you've actually got a group. And before you know it, that's become something bigger. These things sort of, they spiral, things snowball quite amazingly. You do a talk somewhere and hardly anyone asks a question and no one seems to give a shit. And then 6 months later, 2 years later, whatever it might be, you suddenly find that you've had some life-changing impact on someone who's gone off and changed something massive somewhere else. So one of the things that I think to take away from today as well is that don't think that, these things are beyond you. You are agents of change, and it happens. It just happens in a sort of small snowball way, just by doing good work and presenting to people, or in my case, saying yes for a very long time to just about anybody asking me to do a talk anywhere.
A lot of what I was doing, I just got so excited about LCT, about how it helped me explain what I was doing. I just wanted to tell people about it. So I wasn't really trying to change things. I was just being excited, saying, look at this great thing. It explains Unplugged. It explains things what we're doing. And, I was just doing it because when I get inspired about things, I tell people about them. and so that then started to snowball because lots of people started taking it on, and then we get to the policy organizations and so on who are the ones who can really magnify it in a way I can never do on my own, and that's when it snowballs, which is where the knowledge influencers, the knowledge intermediaries come in. You just happen to hit a knowledge intermediary and they go run with it, and then that just sort of one person gets 2 people, which gets 4 people, which gets 8 people, which gets 16 people, and in 20 rounds you're up to 1 million people have been introduced to it, which is basically how viruses work.
And for me,
that exponential spread, if you get to the right people who will talk to multiple other people themselves, and if you can inspire them, just be so excited about it that they become excited about it, then everybody else does the work. You just got the fun of it.
One question that I have, and it's maybe too late for the question, but something to kind of ponder on, is whether there's any interaction between the kind of the coherence of a community or a field and the extent to which ideas like this kind of take hold and build in kind of rapid ways. Because in EAP, LCT is growing, but we're a very fractured field, and there are schisms between practitioners who want to engage with research and theory and those who don't. And I've had really mixed reactions. It's always worked with students. It hasn't always worked with staff. And I've tried to kind of start low and wave up. And as soon as I get to the principles, people switch off. Or not universally. That would be unfair. But in doing it practically, I often refrain from waving up because people don't really want to engage. And so that often then means that the transfer capacity is relatively low level. People take away a segmented bag of tricks. They don't take away the generative principles. And so it kind of feels like these things are not propagating. And I just wonder whether it's because of the fractured nature of the field, why we don't have those particular people. We don't have the same organizations. We don't have the same coherence, which then means that things happen in fits and starts. And there are small networks where it takes off and people really run with it. And there are other people that don't, or misunderstand it, or want to switch off immediately that anything to do with theory is mentioned, and so on. So yeah, I'm that's a question about the.
If I,
Steve,
I mean,
I think that's
can I have a go at that one? Oh, sorry.
sorry, I was going to say, I think that's a really important question, because why is it that it worries them so much as you head towards a more abstract view? Is it that they're really threatened? And is it because they didn't really understand the concrete examples? So while Paul was talking about snowballing, it was only a week ago I had to explain to a Year 9 class what a snowball does as it rolls down a hill. They're in Taree in Australia. They've never seen snow. They have no idea. And because of that, and they're 14 and they don't concentrate on these things, they just didn't get it. And I had to draw a diagram and show them the snowball getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it rolled down the hill. And then I had to bring that back and plaster that analogy and re-explain it. And then they got it. But to us, it would seem to be the bleeding obvious. It's not necessarily to other people. And maybe with semantic waves, we need to be really careful of that our analogies don't always work. And that goes back to the unplugged things that work and the unplugged things that don't work in computer science as well. If your analogy doesn't work for somebody else, then it doesn't work. You've got to think again to get up the hill or down the hill.
So picking the couple of different things there, the network issue, Steve, is maybe because computer science is a relatively new subject to be taught in schools, particularly in primary. It's meant that we've kind of had something new that's happened. So we've got computing at schools where we have this particular teachers association that has quite a cohesive influence and quite a wide influence. And so we have these people like William Lau, Phil Bagg, and I could name a list of them who have big influence. And so once we persuade them, our work is almost done. And then we've also had these big initiatives as well that have kind of if they like something, if you see what I mean, they will then propagate it. So I think the network thing is maybe specific to our field, our discipline, because of the point in time we are. If you go to other countries, they have not yet introduced computer science in schools, or they are a bit late to the party. But where they've got these similar kind of teacher networks, I think it helps them. And then the second thing that Jennifer and yourself were saying about, why is it that for our subject, are teachers quite interested in this in terms of going back up to the top of the wave? I think is because of the nature of our subject and the way the curriculum has been constructed, that we have got this requirement that is very concept heavy. So our curriculum, just because of the way that I think we should teach in England, so there's a philosophy of education there, that it's very concept heavy. The language is hard. So the teachers have just got a challenge. They've got to get the kids to the top of the wave, because that's what the exam requires them to do. So in a sense, it's almost like a confluence of these various factors. One is new. We've got a very concept heavy curriculum. Teachers are desperate and they've already have come together in desperation to sit in darkened rooms together and cry. And Semantic Waves has provided a little light that kind of helps them to talk about what they're doing. And that might not be the same for more established subjects.
And also over the network. So I think computing at school is part of the key behind it. So it was created originally to change the curriculum. It was a small group of people who originally came together saying teaching ICT in the way we're doing it is bad. It's not setting us up for the future. It's boring. It's teaching the wrong thing. And so they were a lobby group that was also a teacher support group. So it originally brought together a bunch of people who were already really interested in changing the curriculum. And then over time, in a relatively short time, they did change the curriculum. And that's partly down to Michael Gove. And that's why it's concept heavy, because it needed to persuade Michael Gove to introduce it. And the only way you could was to convince him it was like physics as a subject. And was about teaching knowledge. So it ended up like that. But then this group of people basically were the early adopters, and they've been there from the start, core to the network, but the network also was very bottom up. So it was all about supporting teachers right from the very start, and it was a foundation of teachers for teachers, but that brought in universities and industry, right from the start. Universities were involved, Google was involved, but it's all had teachers as the focus. And so that has basically grown and built the network, and it created explicitly a network of networks around the country that were all connected together. And so once you've got something that goes into one part of the network, can very quickly spread across the rest of the CAS network. Now it's a little bit more complicated because we've got the NCCE and a bunch of other things going on that dilute that. But I think that is exactly what you're saying. CAS provided that foundation, which was exactly the kind of network that made things work. So things have spread very, very quickly, and teachers talk to other teachers because they're in little local networks that CAS have set up. So you only need one person to come to the national conference and pick up an idea, and there's a whole bunch of influencers then. That one person will influence a lot of other people as a result. So it's very, very, very coherent, and also very focused on teachers at the outset.
Paul and I, we, as part of some funding we had quite a while ago, we used to run the CAS London network, which was the biggest network, and we used to have the big conference, and we were just talking about semantics. But so Paul and I were just doing all these sessions in primary and secondary, and there were like 200 teachers there, but they were all kind of the new little points of contact who then went off to their own regions. But it does make me think as to whether we're very fortunate, because it's a new subject, whether those subjects that are already established, whether it's much harder for them. I don't know.
I mean, I think EAP is a particular case in point because it doesn't know what it is. It's sort of a third field, third space profession anyway. Is it a discipline? Is it not? The routes into it are diverse and fractured. Schisms between people who just want to be teachers and people who are research informed. It's a really fractured place anyway, so that doesn't help. There's not a single disciplinary identity.
So that's the same about computer science. As an academic subject, computer science, that was a very good description of it. We come from engineering, maths, social sciences all over the place, and all those people think computer science are completely different things and don't agree about what it is at all. We've got a mixture of people who think teaching's important, and I think that's perhaps why, for the school thing, it's perhaps helpful that a large number of the teachers had no computer science anyway, so they weren't really coming from one. If you've done a computer science degree, you would have a very specific idea of what computer science was, but we're teaching PE teachers and geography teachers and whatever to survive in a classroom teaching something they don't know. And I think that probably helps, because it also means there's the gap, the problem is there, they're desperate for it to be solved because they've got to survive.